talk about the development of morality and how we as educators can support that development. I like to start with the premise that children have an inner compass. And so our role is more to facilitate their moral development than necessarily to try and impose it from the outside. And this is a bit of a different orientation than how I see that moral development or moral teaching has often been approached. Because often there's a feeling like you almost have to scare children into being good with, different types of scary stories or, emphasizing bad consequences, kind of using slippery slope type of arguments. If you don't wash your hands, then you're going to get very and things like this. So often using fear-based approaches to get people, to help children to respect rules and discipline of society because, they understand that the consequences of doing otherwise would be bad. It's one approach. It has its drawbacks. So I prefer an approach that's based on an understanding that morality is already inherent in the child. This is a more dharmic understanding in yoga language, means that this understanding that there is inherently goodness inside of every being, not just human beings. And it's a seed, it's a potential. It needs nurturing. It needs water, sunlight, air. It needs the right conditions to develop. Otherwise, that seed could remain undeveloped. And certainly there are people who develop in ways that are sociopathic or common language, evil or whatever. So but the goodness in the seed form is there, and we need to help awaken it and strengthen it and exercise it. And we'll talk about practical ways to do this. So what I just said is kind of answering to this question of, is morality socially imposed construct, or is it something inherent in human nature? And if inherent, what's the educational implications? No, so socially imposed means it's just, rules and ideas that we've kind of invented and that we have a convention around following because it has certain benefits for us as a society. Or is there something inherent inside of us that can, that guides us, that's not just rules that we have learned on the outside? And this is really about fundamentally the kind of paradigm with which you approach the human being, because a lot of approaches, not only in education, but just even to the understanding of the human being, especially after World War II, a lot of cynicism about the human nature is there. And kind of, I've been reading an interesting book by Rutger Bregman called Humankind, A Hopeful History. He's a historian, and he looks at a lot of different things with critical thinking, debunking even some commonly accepted theories or studies by looking more deeply into them that support an idea that morality and socially appropriate behavior is only a kind of veneer, only kind of a gloss, and that underneath that, human beings are essentially selfish and willful and uncooperative and only looking out for themselves and things like this. So, and that when you have that conviction, it changes everything about how you approach things like education, how you approach the justice system. When you change the idea and the understanding of the human being as, basically and inherently having goodness, and that if you treat the person that way, you help that to flower. These examples are even relevant to, like I said earlier, the prison system. So most of the prison systems are very punitively focused, but there have been very good results, much better results in Scandinavian countries, for example, in which they really consider that you have to treat the prisoner as your neighbor. And if you treat him like an animal, you're going to have an animal for your neighbor. And if you treat him like a human being, so that the conditions are, much more friendly and not dehumanizing like they are in other types of systems where that veneer theory and cynicism are more predominant. So this is going to be something that really, it's not a small thing, to really believe in that and trust in that that the voice of the conscience, we could call it, that voice of the conscience is actually coming from some deepest layer of our mind, some, even divine layer of our mind, and that it's something that is present. We need to learn to nurture it. I think it was Mother Teresa, or like calls it the still small voice inside. So we have that still small voice, and that voice becomes louder when we listen to it. If we ignore it, it can even disappear. So I call that kind of a compass. No, it's actually, in yogic terminology, we use the word vivek, but it means your conscience, the part of your mind that gives you the feeling and intuition about what is right and wrong. Now, sometimes our aversions, it's really important to separate between what is really intuition and what is maybe my conditioning. So sometimes I might have an aversion towards something because it actually reminds me of something traumatic in my past or whatever. And that aversion, it can feel very deep and it can be easily mistaken for my intuition or my conscience. And it might, the thing is that the voice of your conscience, the actual voice of your conscience, is always going to be divine. It's going to tell you, it's going to guide you in divine directions. Things like, when I say divine, what do I mean by that? I mean, it's not going to tell you to hate people or kill them or whatever. It's going to guide you towards thinking about the positive side of things, looking for the good in things, trying to go deeper, having a deeper perspective on things. So it's aligned with truth, it's aligned with kind of universal truths and values. So it helps you to become more aligned with that when you listen to it. Of course, these days we might say that it's an inner GPS instead of an inner compass, because, who uses a compass anymore? But the idea of like having something that can orient you, that helps you to keep, the goal in sight. You might be aware also that, there's a whole body of research and literature that's springing up in recent years. And this is from an experiment at the Baby Lab in Yale University, where they've been doing research on infants. And the insights that are coming from these types of experiments are that, well, the question that was being researched was the same idea, like, is the idea of good and wrong, good and bad, is that something that children learn, from outside? They learn, because of association and being taught and language and all of these things? Or is there even already inherently, do babies, even before they know all of that, even before they've absorbed all of that, is there already some orientation towards good and bad? Do they already have some sense of it? And so they work with very, very young children, and they expose them to this very simple theater, which shows a character who's acting benevolently and a character who's acting selfishly. Watch what happens. Let me know if the video is working properly.
Is a human baby a purely amoral creature? Just a blank slate who learns from society to respond with compassion to suffering and with outrage to unfairness and injustice? Or is it possible that a baby understands right from wrong at the very start of his or her life? There's a growing body of scientific evidence to support the idea that perhaps some sense of good and evil is bred into the bone. I am Paul Bloom, a psychology professor at Yale University, and I'm part of a team exploring the moral life of babies.
We're here at Yale University's Infant Cognition Center. This center researches what infants know about their physical worlds and their social worlds, and has been doing so for about the last 10 years. So my work here as a graduate student is what infants understand about people as good people and bad people. Whether a young infant, before they're being taught about these kinds of concepts, could make distinctions like these. All right, so we'll have you sit right here with her, and then just scoot her all the way up to the front of the table there. We run puppet shows in the lab.
I'm going to do something fun now, okay?
They are either hand puppets or little wooden shapes in which one character plays the role of the good guy and another character plays the role of the bad guy. Close the curtain. One puppet tries but fails to get to the top of the hill, sort of struggling and falling back down. On alternating trials, we show infants one character who comes and bumps the climbing character up the hill, and down goes the curtain. If you're ready, up goes the curtain. On another trial, we have a character who comes and bumps the character down the hill. Down goes the curtain. And up goes the curtain. Infants see that interaction sort of over and over again, between 6 and 14 times. After they're sort of finished looking at it, when they're nice and bored, we simply ask them to choose between the two characters. All right, great. So we are all done with that part. We're just going to have her choose between the puppets now.
That one.
All right, good job. That was the helpful guy, wasn't it? Astonishingly, really, we are finding that upwards of 80% of babies are choosing the character who was helpful over the character who was unhelpful.
Okay, Ellie.
All right, gorgeous. Can we have that duck each? Thank you. And up goes the curtain. In another of our tests is a character who has a ball, and he plays with his ball sort of happily, and then he drops his ball to one side of the stage or another. At the back of the stage, there are two characters, one of whom runs up when the ball goes over near him, grabs the ball, and gives the ball back to the character who dropped it. On the other hand, the character on the other side of the stage, when he runs up, he grabs the ball and runs off stage with it. So we are just going to have her choose between the puppets now.
Hey, which one do you like? That guy? Okay.
All right, that was the nice guy.
I heard about the concept and I thought it was a really neat idea.
We just like to participate in baby science.
The girls really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun.
To improve our chances of becoming better parents.
In another scenario, we show infants a character who tries but fails to open a box. Okay, gorgeous one. Up goes the curtain. One character comes and helps him open the box after he struggles. And down goes the curtain. Up goes the curtain. Another character comes and jumps down on top of the box, preventing him from doing so. Okay, great. Now we're just going to have her choose between the puppets.
Which one do you like? That one?
So parents often ask us what it might mean that their baby seems to tell the difference between a nice guy and a mean guy.
That's the only question I would really have is, how did my baby do?
And one of the things I think it means is that we spend a lot of time worrying about teaching children the difference between good guys and bad guys in the world, good things and bad things. But that in fact these things might be something that infants just come to the world with.
50 years ago, we didn't understand a lot of what we understand now, what we take for granted.
So pretty interesting, no, for us as educators to see that, and the implications for education are important because, again, it's showing that human beings, there is something already there. You're not just working with something, like she said, a blank slate that has to be explicitly taught these things from the outside. So when you trust and understand that there is that budding sense that even if it's in a seed form, but there's already some attraction towards goodness and some aversion towards selfishness. This has some implications for how we view the human being, how we view the child, what approach we take to teaching values to the child. Are we trying to, only like through repetition and through telling children what they should think and how they should, through stories and things that have good guys and bad guys and try to really make things very explicit to kids that way. It's a different approach than if you think it's already there. It gives you more, I would say it gives you more permission than to have an approach that's more participatory, more open-ended, in which you put questions to children And that's something already I'd like to just touch on, some of the ways when you have this type of understanding of the child as having already some sense of goodness within, how does that change then your approach? Well, what I think is then that how you approach the child is that you see that you give them opportunities to exercise their ways of thinking. Now, if they're very little, I'll show you an interesting video now, another interesting video about how you can also create space for children to exercise their goodness when they're still toddlers. But as they get older and can participate more conversationally, and you can have discussions with them, even simple ones, techniques such as persona dolls, which I don't know if that's been presented yet in other curriculum, other parts of this course, but persona dolls is a type of method in which you are using a doll in a very specific way. It's not in a typical way as a toy, but you're using it to sort of represent a situation and then stimulate discussion. So the persona doll has a whole persona. You've constructed a whole backstory about the doll, which remains consistent every time that you introduce that character into your group. And it has characteristics that the kids will easily resonate with and that contain different elements of diversity in the classroom so that every child can sort of find themselves in the mirror, maybe not of each character. You could have more than one persona doll, but you can have persona dolls that are from minorities or that have single parents or that live with a grandmother, but they also like fried potatoes, which maybe everybody likes in that class. So, you construct all these different elements of their story so that there's some sense of this is somebody just like me. This is somebody that I can relate to. And then the doll goes through different situations, which are very briefly described because you're not doing elaborate storytelling. You tell something like, Melly today, she's very excited because she just got a new pair of glasses and wow, it really helped her to see everything so much better. And she's so happy. And she was really excited to go to her kindergarten. And then when she arrived, one of the kids laughed at her and he said, "Oh, you have 4 eyes." How do you think Melly felt? So already trying to awaken some empathy. How do you think she felt? What could she have done? What do you think she should say? What do you think the other child felt? Why do you think he did that? Have you ever seen a child make fun of somebody? Why do they laugh? Why do other kids laugh? How would you do that? How could you be a good friend? What could she do? No, so like putting all these questions and having kids think and reflect and relate in an empathic way, this is helping them to develop their sense of fairness, to develop their sense of being able to do something. And it prepares their mind. It also inoculates them against bullying because already they kind of see the reactions of their peers. They see the reactions of, to that behavior, which generally everybody doesn't like, And so it's really an interesting technique. There's other ways of doing this. You can also invite, real people to share their stories. I invited my good friend, and also she was working with Amortel, Deepani, and she was from Roma. She's Roma ethnicity, which here in Eastern Europe is very much a discriminated ethnicity and marginalized and stereotyped. And bringing her into the classroom and facilitating, being very careful at how I facilitate this discussion, how I prepared her for it. The children's stereotypes and the kind of disinformation that they'd received from the media they didn't have any shame about hiding it. Now, immediately when we presented her as the Tsiganka, there was one child that went, "Ew, yucky." And then, all the children started to talk about how the Roma are bad and that they'd seen it on TV and like this. This led to a whole critical reflection discussion in which I didn't tell them, "No, you shouldn't say that. No, that's not polite. No, that's not nice." No, all of this thing about not nice, not polite doesn't get to the essence of the matter. Then it's just about niceness and politeness. It's not about that the thinking was wrong. It's just that, think about it. If you tell kids something's not nice or not polite, you're not helping them to reflect and to correct any mistake in their thinking. So ethics and moral development and reflection are very intertwined. The ability to critically reflect and the ability to make moral decisions, they're really intertwined. Without reflection, then people might do moral things. But anyway, we'll talk about the stages of moral development in a minute, and that will make it a little more clear. Let me go forward with some other slides. So this is, oops, something weird happened to, sorry about that, something very strange happened to the text there. But this is another similar experiment with a bit older child, so not a baby, but a toddler. And I'd like you to observe how the adult acts.
Oh. Oh. So. So. Einmal hier und einmal. Oh. Oh. Ah, ja. So. Hä? Oh. Oh.
So I get the idea. It goes on for a bit, but it's all of these different situations in which the adult is acting incompetent, is making a mistake, is doing something wrong. And the child comes forward to help and to correct, which is also really interesting because generally, especially in teaching situations, adults are always super competent, And I think it's an interesting game to play with kids in a way, to give them the space to show their competency, to give them the space to demonstrate their helpfulness and to come forward. So like if the adults, how can people working with children sometimes create that space so the child can come forward and demonstrate helpful behavior. And you see how good they feel. It gives them such a sense of self-esteem. I think one of the best ways to build self-esteem is to give opportunities for children to contribute and to help. And as Kathleen was saying, if we're thinking about the longer term of what we're trying to achieve, if we want to have new humanist children that grow up into new humanist adults, and what does that mean? And what does the future need? We need to move towards more and more participatory civilization, more cooperative spirit, more helpfulness, service-mindedness, to overcome some of the limitations of individualism that are present in our capitalistic structures. And so giving children an opportunity to build self-esteem, not just by praise or by overinflating their egos, but actually through meaningful ways of contributing to their world, so it's like, oh, I need to wash the table. And if you can make space for the child to help you with that, if you can give them space to experience their own competency, to experience they can do things, they can help, they are important, they make a difference, they make other people happy by their contribution, you're reinforcing that goodness within the child, and you're reinforcing that kind of that experience of their goodness, because you're good when you also do good things somehow. So you have to create space for it. If all the adults are taking care of everything, doing everything perfectly, there's no space for that contribution from the children. So I just ask you as educators to think about that and think about how could you do that, and maybe we can discuss it in the when we do the discussion. So seeing children as competent learners, seeing them as constructing their moral framework. Your idea isn't to impose the framework. Your idea is to facilitate it, to help it to bloom from within. It's also important to kind of backtrack a little bit, understand what are the frameworks that already exist? What are the frameworks that are being used currently to understand moral development in children and also in adults? One of the most famous thinkers is Kohlberg, and he articulated these stages of moral development. Now, the first stage is stage 1, pre-conventional. Okay, so this is kind of really basic stuff, like, will I get in trouble? So kids follow rules like, it's like, okay, I follow the speed limit when I think there's no police watching. not as a principle of safety, but like if I know I might get in trouble and I might get caught because there's a lot of police in the zone, that's kind of a stage 1 level of thinking of moral reasoning. Like I follow the rules when I think that when I might get in trouble if I don't. No, what's in it for me? Now a little bit more. Like, okay, I can be motivated positively if I see some benefit for myself in the moral behavior, but it's not a principle, it's more self-centered. These first 2 stages are very egocentric. Stage 3 is, now this they call the conventional level. This is interesting. Conventional level means that the orientation towards moral behavior is much more concerned with what the external world thinks and how they will judge me, rather than any type of particular internalized principle or guiding force or internalized conscience. It's more oriented towards, okay, I'm going to follow this, what does everybody else think? What am I supposed to do? It's the good girl, good boy type of level, goody-goodiness. I should do what everybody else is doing. Of course, if everybody else is not following a rule, I probably won't follow it either. If there's no particular judgment or shame about not following a rule, if everybody's cheating, then I probably will cheat too. And it's also when people become very oriented on, they want to know what the rules are for everything. What's the rule about this? Again, it's looking for a rule. It's looking for something external to measure what I should do and shouldn't do. So I'm very interested in the law. I'm very oriented on rules and regulations and so forth. Now, stage 5 is post-conventional. This is where the person gains enough confidence in their own inner discrimination between good and bad, that they're not just looking externally to what everybody does, to what's the rules. They're thinking, what's the spirit behind the rule? What's this rule trying to achieve? What's fair? What's kind? No, so it's a different level of criteria. It's more internalized. Stage 6 is more principle-based. This is where what is the right thing to do according to rational principles of justice. This is where the concept of justice would be more blind. Like, I am not going to be affected by my sentimental attachment to that person because I'm empathic towards them. I'm going to think, no, what's really fair, indifferent of my personal biases and my personal feelings. What is the fair thing? What is the correct thing? What's the principled thing? Okay, so each of these stages shows an increasing internalization of principle. Now, what's interesting is these stages of moral development here are neatly presented as if there's some sequential order that happens, like developmental stages of children that happens, at this age, this happened, at this age, this happens, at this. It's not like that with moral development. And I also would like to point out, like, for example, even somebody who might mostly be on stage 6 or stage 5, if you put them under extreme stress, they're probably going to revert back even to stage 1 or 2. Because if you were to think of this, Kathleen and I were talking yesterday, if you were to think of like the neurobiological ideas that we have now about reptilian brain and so forth, your reptilian brain is always going to operate on 1 and 2. It's pre-conventional, doesn't even care what other people say. It's totally oriented towards survival. And so that can happen if somebody's enough under threat. They can lose track of their principles and their moral development and act in ways that would be very reptilian in that moment because they've reverted all the way back. So moral development isn't linear, neatly linear like this. And you can have people that are 50 years old and they're still basically only in stage 3, and they might never get to stage 5 or 6 on their own. No. And especially you could say that education, the way it's typically oriented, is mostly oriented at stage 3 and 4. It's mostly about making rules, getting people to follow rules, and creating social pressure and conformity. No, and so that's what typical education does. It really enhances, it really like gets people into the conventional level of morality. And in fact, you could even say it's one of the functions of how education is typically conceived, to get people to sort of behave and to fit in and integrate into the society. However, Kohlberg was somebody who went through World War II. And let's see, I have another quote about that, but I think I put it a little later. Well, let me just find it. Here it is. So Hein Ginot, who said, "My eyes saw what no person should witness: gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is help your children become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human. So what he's pointing out is, that, in fact, that's what motivated Kohlberg to do this whole understanding of moral development, because he was haunted by how can these people that consider themselves basically good human beings, they go home, they tuck their children into bed, they kiss their wife, how can they participate in these things that look so morally outrageous? And that's where he developed this idea of, well, there's a conventional level of morality in which people are more oriented towards, well, what did my boss say? Well, it wasn't my responsibility. I just received orders, or what's everybody else doing, and that makes it right just because everybody else is doing it. And so, he saw the need for developing a broader understanding of moral reasoning and moral development, and how can we enhance stages 5 and 6. So stages 5 and 6 are not just about conformism to external rules. This really is where really very much tied up in rationalist, what we would call in neo-humanism, rationalistic mentality. Helping people to develop rationalistic mentality means critical thinking, being able to analyze pro and con and so forth. Let me see if I can find that slide too. Here it is. So study, analysis, and then, in neo-humanist thinking, the neo-humanist thinking is not just study and analysis. It's also applying that ethic called samasamaja tattva, meaning, or also called the blissful or non-blissful auxiliary, which means thinking about collective welfare. It's an ethical filter. What's actually for the best, not just for me, which would be conventional or pre-conventional thinking. What's the best for everybody? What's really for the welfare of all? And that's a much broader filter to filter our decisions through. So this also brings us to the idea, me as an educator, how can I facilitate children to have this type of awareness, to develop this type of ability to look at, both sides of a situation, to make, to analyze it, to think about it more carefully, not just sentimentally, and then to think what would be the welfare for all. How do we do this? Well, part of it is, creating situations where there isn't a clear right and wrong, and having children discuss it, having them think, creating situations that bring the prejudices and the sentiments right to the surface so that you can talk about them. They haven't yet crystallized and become very deeply embedded if you're working with early childhood care. If you're talking with older children in high school, I can also touch on examples for that a bit later, because that's something I'm currently involved in. But let's say with the early childhood, what I did with my colleague Deepani when we were presenting her was also, to ask the children, what do they really think? How do you think? First we created again the empathic connection. Okay, Deepani, what do you enjoy doing? Oh, me too, me too. So there was some relationship there. When you were a child, what was your favorite food? Oh, me too. Creating that kind of sense of connection, that she's not somebody alien, that she's somebody that's like them. And then, was there anything that ever hurt your feelings? Yeah, there were sometimes kids that didn't want to play with me because they said that I'm black like a crow, which is an expression in Romanian, a kind of racist slur about skin color. And I said, oh, how did that make you feel? I felt so sad. Sometimes I went home and cried. And then we asked the children, what do you, if you were Yulia's, if you were there, what would you have done? Oh, I wouldn't have let them say that. I would do this, I would do that. We role played it. Nobody wanted to role play the child saying the mean things. They only wanted to role play being her friend. And asking them also, I remember asking them, what does your heart really say? Because the first things that came up were all the stereotypes. But I put them to think, okay, but you've heard that in the news, you've heard it like that. Let's think about that a little bit more. Do you think that also in the US you've seen that on the television? Have you also seen on the television about robbers in the US? Oh yeah, there's films about that, yeah. So do you think that all Americans are robbers? Oh no. And then I got to facilitate their thinking eventually to this idea that there's good and bad people everywhere. But also I asked them, what does your heart say? What do you really think? not just what you heard on the TV. What do you really think? So few people ask children this, because children are basically looking at the adult world as a huge source of authority, and they mostly accept whatever they see. So even if a stereotype, I really believe that stereotypes and racism and things like this, they hurt our sense of fairness when we're children. But because they come from such an authoritative and powerful source, and they're so ubiquitous, they're present everywhere, we accept them as true and right, but it hurts us. So if you give space to children to also question these things, and to also think like, what does your heart really say? What do you really think is true? It gives them space then to express, you know, this deeper part of their intuition, this deeper part of their conscience. You know, I want to ask Kathleen, how am I doing on time? I can't see.
Well, it is 11:12, and I've scheduled you till 11:30, but we can, you know, this is so interesting. I wouldn't want to cut you short.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much I can say on this. I would like to say that also, you know, things that we do typically in neo-humanist education, share my screen again, like creating quiet spaces, quiet corners, creating quiet moments, and encouraging children to, you know, express things from within. This is also creating space, spaciousness. I feel that, you know, in order for intuition to emerge, in order for a conscience to emerge, in order for a voice from within to emerge, if the child is constantly stimulated and where everybody's trying to put stuff into its mind and it's just getting lots and lots and lots of stimulation, then there isn't space for the development of that inner voice. So recognizing the importance of the inner life of the child and giving space for that through creating these quiet moments is actually one of the things that we can do, and that you probably already do. That is, but you know, just doing it in a conscious way, seeing how it connects to the whole strategy of what we're trying to do. You know, that quiet space is also, you know, again, you don't have to fill it up with guiding them through every moment of the quiet moment. You know, you can leave spaciousness in there for them to, you know, there always should be something open-ended inside of the quiet moment, in which the child is invited to feel something deeper within. So, and talking about it, another really important, I think, technique, we can say, is this idea of, again, with the idea of facilitating thinking and ethical thinking. How do children learn ethical thinking? If it's not just through telling them what to think, then how does it emerge? How can we do it in a more emergent way? And I believe that part of that is through revealing how we make ethical decisions. So this really requires the teacher to be willing to put to put him or herself into not just being a detached kind of observer, but like really using yourself, your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own experiences as part of the teaching relationship. You know, teaching isn't just a one-directional thing. It can be very interactive, and it can involve a process of even using the teaching experience as a sort of self-reflection. So when you are able to be reflective together with children and discuss why you make certain decisions or what you think about certain things and why, and involve like a sort of walk them through your own ethical reasoning process by talking about it and by inviting them, what do you think? What would you have done? This is really helping children then to gain a lot more intrapersonal intelligence, I believe. They found, you know, and this has been studied to some extent, maybe not so much with ethics, but like with things like social emotional intelligence. They find that parents who have a regular habit of going home at night, sitting around the table, like having a family moment where they share the meal together, and where they discuss their day, and the parents that have a habit of doing storytelling about their day, and where they tell, how not only what happened, but how they felt about what happened. Like, so today I got into an argument with my colleague. Oh, and it really, I was so angry with her. I was so upset. But then, you know what I did? I went and I took a walk and I drank some water to calm down, to cool down. And then I was able to find a nice way to talk to her. This doesn't have to be contrived. No, it should be based on real experiences. Of course, maybe some things where you didn't control yourself so well or whatever, you're not happy about it. You can also say that rather than trying to sugarcoat it or something. But, you know, it helps children to understand the complexities of emotions if you don't just talk about things, but also about feelings, how you felt about them. So that's one level that's already very useful for social emotional intelligence, but we're taking it a step further also into ethics. You know? So it's where you also then reveal how you made a decision, you know, well, you know, I know that, you know, I really want to, you know, find a way to talk to her that is kind. I was so tempted to say something mean because, you know, she really irritated me. But, you know, I you know, did this because that was the kinder thing to do. So you're demonstrating then through your behavior and also through how you tell the story, you're demonstrating, you know, how do we use ethics inside of our mind to regulate our behavior, you know? And so this means that you have to be aware of your own processes of regulating your behavior with ethics, because if you have no self-awareness, you're not going to have any examples to share with the children. So, you know, it again is about the self. This again brings into it that the ethical development and facilitating the moral development of children means also to be very self-aware of your own moral development and your own ethical processes, and to take, you know, and to be able to reflect on them, and such that you would even be comfortable reflecting on them together with children, and to bring that into some of the, you know, how you facilitate discussions around ethics. So, because ethics shouldn't just be something dry and abstract or something you learn about in university. This is what really helps us to bring out the best parts of our character, to be the best that we can be, when we don't just do whatever comes to our mind, whatever impulse comes to our mind, but when we regulate our behavior with a set of principles. And that's bringing us up to level 5 of moral development in Kohlberg. I do also want, though, just for fairness, that Kohlberg was not the only theoretician here. I also want to show you guys that there's also a feminist scholar, Carol Gilligan, who kind of did a critique on this. And she was like, I'm not so sure that this is really descriptive of all human experience of moral development, because, you know, you only studied young, white, well-to-do males from the Western Hemisphere. It was like British schoolboys, or maybe American, I don't remember, but definitely from a native speaking English place, wealthy, well-to-do, la, la, la. And she's like, I don't know that this is so universally applicable. So she kind of came up with an alternative structure where she talks also about the ethics of care. How do you care for people? So she has the stage of pre-conventional, I love me, gradually becomes I love you. And then it's going from I love you to I love you more than me. I'm more concerned about what you think than about me. And then and about what I think inside. And then the post-conventional to be I love myself and I love you. So that's also a different alternative spin on it. I do have to say that even though she launched that critique, there have been subsequent studies that sort of backed up that even cross-culturally and with different genders and things like this, that still the stages of Kohlberg's theory seem to have validity, but it doesn't, one doesn't invalidate the other. Rather, I think that they're and they lead to a richer understanding of moral development. You know, besides not being linear, the other thing that I find problematic with Kohlberg's stages is that Kohlberg's talking about the stages of moral development, but what he's actually talking about is not moral development, moral reasoning. So what they do, the experiments that generated this data were things like, there's a train coming, and if you push this lever, then, you know, and it's going to hit like some children playing on the tracks. But if you divert it, then the train will hit, you know, 5 people that are older, you know, and so you have to make this decision about which lever you would push, or whether you would do nothing or what you would do. But it's these very abstract, very unlikely to ever happen in real life situations, very theoretical. And so all the reasoning is purely abstract. But we know that moral development, in my mind, isn't just about your ability to make some type of abstract, solve some type of abstract ethical dilemma. It's about how do you act day to day? Are you able to act in accordance with what your morality says? You might be able to have very good moral reasoning, but be very weak in moral courage. And without moral courage, you might know what's a good thing to do, but you don't do it. No? So besides just reasoning, it's not just, morality is not an intellectual process. Morality has to translate into action. And so one of the components, you might know this marshmallow experiment, we don't have time to look at it, but the components, Berkowitz is another researcher who built on these theories of Kohlberg, but he goes much more into detail and he talks about these components like that are foundational, means they're like prerequisites. Before you can get to real moral development, you have to have certain things which aren't in and of themselves moral, but they need to be there. They're the groundwork that you build on. Social orientation, so being able to think not only about self, but thinking about others and their feelings. Self-control, being able to control impulses. Compliance, being able to follow instructions and and rules. Self-esteem. And then he also has, and the base for all of this is secure attachment, which again is really important in humanist education, understand how important those loving, secure relationships are in order for there to be a proper moral development. And in fact, this is something I struggle with. I deal with children who haven't had secure attachments because of trauma and so forth. And it does affect their ability to think morally. They tend to be stuck more in pre-conventional, very self-oriented because they're still in survival mode because they don't have that security. So how can you, heal that, or can you? And then these other aspects of moral functioning like empathy, conscience, moral reasoning, and altruism. So I think somehow I've touched on all of these, that the, not in detail, but like how it is important to give children the opportunity to experience their altruism, to offer service to others. Moral reasoning is actually that kind of like, critical thinking that involves what's right and what's wrong, what's fair, having these types of discussions with children. Conscience, how do you develop that voice from within? What does your heart really say? What do you really think is true? Which is helping people, even children, to go beyond just what the society is telling, to help go beyond just conventional, but to think, more deeply. And empathy, being able to understand other people's feelings, the social emotional intelligence and so forth. That's so important to develop. So I hope that all of this has, I know it's a lot of information. Let me see if there's any slide that I want to close that with. But I hope that it's given you some food for thought about how you can practically translate this into action also in classrooms. I focused mostly on examples with early childhood, but of course, it's, you can go even more into detail with this in even more interesting ways with adolescents. One of the most, I think, interesting things to do is propose different types of simulations where kids are put into a situation and then they have to, think what to do and why, and you discuss after that why they had different choices. What did they do? What was the fair solution? Kathleen, what was that example that you told me that I thought was really brilliant last night? It was just a simple question. What would you do without money or something?
Right. It was just a simulation that teachers can do with even quite young children, like third and fourth graders, of how would you design a society that had no money? And it just stimulates a lot of creative thinking.
Yeah, and you can always bring in, like, there can be, it depends on the teacher, because you can take a situation that would be ordinarily maybe just an exercise in critical thinking or creativity, and you can then bring in the dimension of ethics always to talk about things that happen within the simulation game or some of the discussions children have, and you can bring in the dimensions of talking about what's fair, what's not fair, why do you think it's like that? And what do you think is the right thing to do? So instead of imposing these ideas of right and wrongness, but to really stimulate kids to do their own thinking about it. And of course, you're there as a scaffold. You're there to guide it. You're there to kind of lead it in a direction, but without imposing it, helping to, I like the word scaffolding and I can't think of a better word, but I hope you know that idea already from the ideas of emergent curriculum. Know that you're not just, you create situations and then you're there it's also this idea of the zone of proximal development. If you don't position yourself too far away from where the children are, you kind of come down to their level, but a little bit higher. It helps them to rise up. It helps them to rise up. It helps them to rise up and to structure their thinking better than if you were to just completely leave them on their own. So that's a very skillful art of facilitation that I think is essential also for bringing out the moral development of children, is to be able to develop these skills as a facilitator of reflection. You want kids to use the ability to self-reflect and to refer to principles that make sense to them as being fair, and that those kind of universal principles guide their decisions on a day-to-day basis. And to do that, besides just the techniques I talked about, obviously some of the biggest opportunities for teaching are looking for the teachable moments, looking for the conflicts that arise in classrooms between children as a wonderful source of teaching material that you don't have to invent, and that you can simply, when there's conflicts that arise, those are great opportunities to really explore all the aspects of moral decision making. What's right? What do you think? What was he feeling? Why do you think he was feeling that? All of these wonderful techniques of conflict resolution can be super relevant for developing also moral reasoning and moral behavior if the teacher sees conflicts as teachable moments.
Great. Well, thank you, Didi. This was a wonderful presentation. If you have a few more minutes for us, I'd like to open it up in case someone has a comment or a question for Didi while she's here. I imagine there was an awful lot to think about, but if you could just raise your hand or put something in the chat that you'd like Didi to address.
Lolita's asking for the video link. I honestly don't remember where I got it right now. I'd have to search for it myself in YouTube. If you look for Paul Bloom and infant research, I think it was from the New York Times. Anyway, I can try searching for it as well on YouTube. And if I find it, I can put it on the WhatsApp group. And Dada, I agree with you about your judgment about the stage one. Anyone else?
We have a few minutes here. Questions, comments? I'm glad you brought up Carol Gilligan, and I would remind people way back in the philosophy of education course, we read an article that you all liked a lot by Nell Noddings called The Challenge to Care. And she had based her whole theory of education on Carol Gilligan's work. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I think she really brings another dimension into it, because sometimes I also find that, if you don't bring in also what is the loving thing to do, something might seem fair. I wish I could think of a specific example, but something might be fair in a sort of cold way. But I don't know, bringing in that care dimension into it seems to me to make things much more right. Bringing in the compassion, that things aren't just, oh, well, we'll just apply this and, that's the law. And so therefore, and that's the principle. And it really should, in my mind, it makes sense, Carol Gilligan's approach of really tying it into the compassionate response and to a connected way of thinking instead of this more dry intellectual way of thinking. Because I feel the Kohlberg stage presenting the ultimate stage is like a very dry intellectual, I'm not going to be affected by anything emotional. I'm only going to make a purely intellectual reasoning here, which I don't know. I mean, like in the practical world, I feel that the right thing to do is often, like, for example, I don't know, I remember hearing a story in a training center about a brother who was stealing bread. He had this obsession with bread and he was eating bread. And so the trainer called him and instead of scolding him and saying, no, it's not right because you're taking all the bread and the other people can't have bread. What did he do? He said, guys, just bring as much bread as possible. Let him eat as much as he can. And he encouraged him to eat as much as he could. And he was, he kind of tried to overfill that need that wasn't there and take it out of the shameful shadows and just really put it there openly. And it really had an effect. I mean, the person was able to change their behavior. Sometimes, the thing that actually can be compassionate and that can actually help to change somebody isn't just, intellectual, like there's an intuitive sense of what will, and a caring, a compassionate connection there that helps bring out the moral behavior more than a punitive, purely intellectual approach.
All right. I don't see any other hands up. So, Didi, we probably need some time to think about all this and process it. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, and we'll send any feedback or ideas or questions we have your way.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Nice to see everybody. It's been a while. It's been a year since I've seen most of you. So it's really wonderful.